Yeah, well, let me just say first, I think you're right that something is changing also in Europe, though, that more people are questioning the war propaganda because they realize, well, more people are seeing that the facts that the vast majority of Ukrainians want peace, yet they also see that their own politicians boycott diplomacy and instead give their full support for Zelensky's regime, who's hunting Ukrainians on the street to send them to the front line. I mean, and this is all sold as helping Ukraine. So even as the opposition in Ukraine, the pro-Western one, begins to criticize this, I think more people are waking up that perhaps, governments sometimes lie during wars. But
sometimes I
sometimes
think there's more than just periodic lying. I think it's become, the stock and trade of too many governments too often.
Well, I did read your article, though, because I thought this is interesting, also in the context of what you said about, you want to preserve the West, and indeed, I think we all share that sentiment. But in order to preserve the West, one have to adjust to reality. And preserving the West can't always only mean that all other centers of powers have to be defeated, because if that's not an achievable outcome, you end up destroying the West with this objective. But the reason I liked your article so much is, I mean, if we take a step back from all these day-to-day issues, we can see the larger changes which hasn't happened in history. That is 500 years of Western power and leadership is coming to an end. And again, finding a new role for the West in the world is quite pivotal, instead of just trying to knock our heads against the wall and get back hegemony. But how are you reading this history, though, the end of this 500-year period?
Well, I don't see it as the end of Western power and influence. I see it as the end of our dominance.
Sorry, that's much better.
The multipolar world is not the end for the United States or anyone in Europe. Quite the contrary. I think it's a huge opportunity. But what we have to do is something that happened over time after 1492. The reason I invoked 1492 is a good friend of mine in Croatia was looking at what was going on in Belgrade and other major capitals, and looked at the influx of Chinese investment and so forth. And he just offhandedly said to me, we're beginning to see something that is significant. Maybe this is 1492 all over again. And that triggered the article that I wrote, because I think he's got a point. We're seeing new trade routes, new opportunities, and we're recognizing that other states, other economies have comparative advantages. Every nation state, in my judgment, at some point, has to identify its comparative advantage in certain areas. It has to recognize that in other areas, they don't have a comparative advantage. That's all right. You rectify that situation by economic cooperation through trade and commerce. So that's what we have to sit down and think about. One of the things I also mentioned in that article that we've ignored for a very long time, if you go back 100 years ago, we had probably the world's largest merchant marine fleet. One of the reasons we were able to so rapidly resupply the British overseas, both in World War I and then in World War II, was that we had this enormous merchant fleet. What happened to it? We essentially opted out. Somebody decided that they could make more money by selling it off than they could by maintaining it and exploiting it. Same thing is true with rail. The United States had probably the greatest railroad system in the world. This is especially true after 1870. Once we have the Civil War behind us, what have we done with it? Perhaps we're all waiting for the aliens to land and to provide us with some new technologies that makes everything we own obsolete. Maybe that'll happen at some point, but right now we're still dealing with the laws of physics. There is a good rationale for the United States that sits in the middle of the world to invest very heavily in fast sea lift and fast high-speed rail. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at Rome and the Roman Empire, the big advantage the Romans had was they sat in the middle of the Mediterranean. And with their legions and fleets and roads and bridges, they could create networks of trade that made Rome wealthy and powerful. Now, nothing ever lasts forever, but my point is we need to look at that example and begin to see ourselves a little differently. Instead of looking at the One Belt, One Road as a danger, can we build a fast sea lift that can move goods, say, from Rochefort in France to the east coast of the United States, put them on high-speed rail, and move from there to Los Angeles or San Francisco or Puget Sound and Seattle, Washington, and then from there rapidly to Europe on fast sea lift? Now, I'm saying Europe, Japan, and Northeast Asia and China. We also have this Arctic passage that's opened up. There are a lot of reasons for us to look into this. Why? Because we have had historically a tremendous advantage. The advantage is that from Atlantic to Pacific, from Pacific to Atlantic, we speak one language. We have one law. When you move goods from Shanghai all the way up through Central Asia and then down into the Middle East or west towards Europe, how many countries and nation states do you pass through? How expensive is it to move those things? Every one you encounter, and I've got friends that are in China tell me this all the time, as soon as you show up and you're Chinese, say, we want to build a terminal here, we want to put this here, everyone stands there and says, here's my hand, fill it with cash, please. Well, there's no requirement for that. We can move everything from coast to coast without going through multiple countries. We need to think about this. We have refused to think about it. We have refused to invest in it. Instead, where have we spent trillions of dollars? Trillions of dollars intervening in countries and societies that are radically different from ours, in many cases killing hundreds of thousands, displacing millions, destroying economies, distorting regional dynamics, distorting power arrangements in favor of what we think is to our advantage. Well, I've been looking over the last 30 plus years of interventions. I can't find any advantage. I don't see how we strategically have profited dramatically from any of these interventions. Yet that's the underlying assumption in Washington. You know, you intervene in Libya, and what do you get for your trouble? You get chaos. You destroyed the dynamics in the region. Everyone in North Africa is afraid of you. No one really trusts you. If you go into Latin America right now, and we have this armada we're setting up north of Venezuela, everybody looks at Venezuela in isolation from the rest of Latin America. But you can't. Venezuela is part of another continent. If you go into Venezuela, you destroy the power structure in Venezuela. You distort the relations that Venezuela has with its neighbors. You're not just going to end up fighting people in Venezuela. You're going to see paramilitaries from Brazil pour in there to help the Venezuelans fight us. You're going to see the same thing from Colombia. You may see it come in from Peru. In other words, what you think you're doing in one location inevitably has consequences for all the countries around it. We've ignored that. Now, the Middle East is a unique set of circumstances. Every place you go is different. We have to understand that. We've never bothered to look at it from that vantage point. And we have to get out of this business of, once again, seeing military power as the solution that will make us happy, make us rich, make us powerful. It isn't working. It hasn't worked. It's a dead end.
That's the frustrating part as we seek to restore the 1990s. Nobody wants to ask that question, that what was actually achieved since the 1990s. Because, as you said, all of these military adventures, they all led to disaster, and we went from the 90s of unprecedented concentration of power in the West to now this collapse in economic security, political power, as well as the reputation, and internal stability. So it is strange that no one's looking at a different approach. It is always this same knee-jerk reaction and empty slogans. But what do you see as a different strategy, though? What should the United States be doing now, in your opinion? Again, if Trump is listening to you, what would you tell him?
Yeah, well, our first step, I say this is particularly true in Asia, and also, I would argue, to a large extent, increasingly in the Middle East. We need to demilitarize our relations with the rest of the world. A good example of the demilitarizing, this man, Lutnick, who works with President Trump, attended a meeting, and he sat across from a delegation from India. and the discussion was about commerce and trade. And the Indian leader of the delegation actually asked him, well, what can we do in order to improve our relationship, strengthen our relationship? And Mr. Lutnick said immediately, you can buy more of our military equipment. What? In other words, the only thing that we're producing right now, it's not the only thing because we produce a lot of energy. We're not doing a very good job of it, but we do. We also have a tremendous agrarian sector. And again, I don't think we're getting nearly out of it what we should. But this notion of buy our military equipment is bizarre. You know, this is the one manufacturing sector that we've got that we seem to push very hard. This means that by definition, you buy our military equipment, then you are allied or partnered with us. Well, India has just demonstrated very clearly that India would like to have good relations with us, but India has its own interests. And those interests involve good relations with Russia and increasingly with China. You know, people in this country, the so-called elites, have been saying, well, India is going to go to war with China. That's inevitable. Really? Why? What are they going to fight over? Are they going to fight over terrain that's 15,000, 16,000 feet above sea level? To adjust boundaries, 5 miles, 10 kilometers? What? It's ridiculous. And why is it in our interest that India and China should go to war? It isn't. The supposition is it's a zero-sum game. In other words, if someone overseas goes to war, we profit. No, we don't. That's ridiculous thinking. In other words, we need to get back to where we were, I would argue, even despite the Cold War and the obvious fears of the Soviet Union, back to where Eisenhower looked at the world and felt that the most important thing we can do is to build prosperity at home. And then he borrowed once again from Washington and Hamilton and tried to export prosperity. You know, this was the other point that was made over and over and over again after our country was founded. People immediately sprung up with the notion that we should invade other places and, quote unquote, spread the revolution. And of course, at the time, Washington and Hamilton in particular, Jefferson was the exception, looked at this and said, well, that's a brilliant idea. Then eventually we'll have the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, the British all landing on our shores to crush us because they will perceive us to be a threat. And Washington made the point that we should be an example to the world. How do you do that? Well, you become prosperous in your own right. Then you export that prosperity to others. That's where we've got to get back to. We can be the world's engine of prosperity. That's what we were. That's what made us so popular. A friend of mine was telling me the other day, he was looking back at the Versailles process. And he noted something that I thought was very, very interesting. He said that the Syrian people, in other words, the leaders of the Syrian people, I'm not talking about the French, who ended up dominating Syria after World War I. He was saying that the Syrian representatives to Versailles actually approached the American delegation and said, we don't really want the French or the British or anybody else from Europe in our country. But we all admire the United States. We know that you're fair-minded. You are not interested in conquering other people's countries. Could you come as part of the mandate and help us rule ourselves in Syria? I mean, stop and consider that. Do you think we'd have a delegation from Syria fly to Washington and ask Americans to come and help them rule themselves today? Not likely. So we've destroyed the reputation that we built over 150 years. We're in a very bad position now because people no longer think of us as we would like them to. We are not a beacon of light. We're not the shining city on the hill. And Americans are offended. I talk to Americans, oh, well, what do you mean by that? You sound to me like you're not an America first guy. I said, no, absolutely I'm an American first person, absolutely, without question. But they don't understand what we've done to ourselves because to the average American, all of us wear white hats. We're the good guys. And you see, Washington takes advantage of this assumption and proselytizes to the population, well, we're spreading liberal democracy, human rights, freedom. Well, that's all crap, and we know it. That's not what we're about. That's not what we've been doing. So if we demilitarize our relations with the rest of the world and then begin to look at ways to do business with the rest of the world, and I think we can get back to something that was much better than what we have today. Because right now, we are not viewed very positively in the world.